I never imagined it would come to this.
I went to my boyfriend's apartment to throw him a surprise birthday party, but when I opened the door, the surprise was on me. Finn Callahan was in his bed with another woman. I walked out without saying a word, and half an hour later I was at a bar in Chicago trying to drown everything in whiskey. That's where I did something I never should have done. I looked at the man standing in front of me and, half drunk, I let it slip. You're way more handsome than your son. The problem is he wasn't just my ex's father. He was Ronan Callahan, the most powerful Don in Chicago. And that night, I kissed the man who could destroy my life. Chapter 1. The Night That Wasn't in the Plan. I had planned every detail of that night with the kind of care that belongs to someone who believes love is proven in small, well-thought-out gestures. The fresh pasta had been made from scratch. The sauce had taken 40 minutes on low heat, and the spare key I'd had copied weeks earlier sat at the bottom of my purse, like a pretty little secret waiting to be revealed. It was Finn's birthday, and I wanted him to come home and find everything ready. The table, the food, me. The idea seemed perfect as I crossed the lobby of his building with the glass jar in my hands and a smile that didn't yet know its days were numbered. The elevator rose slowly, as it always did in that old building on the north side of Chicago, and I remembered to fix my cardigan in the polished metal mirror inside the cab. I'd put on the perfume he liked. I'd spent hours picking the right outfit, and I was so deep inside my own fantasy of the perfect surprise that I didn't notice, in that moment, that something in the air of the hallway was off. There was nothing concrete, no sound, no obvious sign, but there was a kind of heaviness I only came to recognize much later, when it was already too late for anything. I slipped the key into the lock carefully, trying not to make a sound, because the whole idea was to show up unannounced and see his face the exact moment he found me there. The door gave way with that soft click I knew by heart, and the apartment was dark at the entrance, but there was light at the end of the hall, and there was a low sound I refused to identify until the second I had no choice. I called his name once, softly, still smiling, still inside the dream. And then, I followed the sound to the bedroom. The glass jar left my hands before I was even aware I'd let it go. The sound it made hitting the marble echoed through the entire apartment like a sentence spoken with perfect clarity, and it was the only sound I made in that moment, because my voice had completely disappeared. Finn was in bed. He wasn't alone. The woman with him was older, dark-haired, and they both turned at the same time when the jar fell, wearing that specific expression of people who've been caught and haven't yet decided which lie to use. I didn't say a word. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't throw anything. I looked at the shattered glass on the floor, at the sauce spread across the pale marble, and then I looked at Finn, one last time, long enough to burn it in, and picked up the purse I'd left on the chair by the entrance. I walked out without closing the door, not because I wanted drama, but because my hands simply couldn't find the strength for anything beyond gripping the strap of my purse and moving my feet one in front of the other down the hallway. The elevator took 30 seconds to arrive, and those 30 seconds were the most silent of my life. When the doors opened, I stepped in, pressed my back against the cold metal wall, and stared at the ceiling while the mirror handed me back a version of myself I didn't yet know how to read. The shock was too big to fit into the shape of tears. It was a solid, dense weight, the kind that settles in your chest before you fully understand what you've lost, and I stood there while Chicago kept on existing outside, completely indifferent to the fact that something inside me had just shattered on the 12th floor marble. I walked out of the building, stopped on the sidewalk, and stared at nothing for a few seconds. The October wind cut across my face with that particular Chicago coldness that always feels a little personal. I grabbed my phone. "Jade, what's wrong?" She answered on the second ring, with the voice of someone already awake but pretending otherwise. "I need a drink." A short pause. "How bad?" "Bad. I'm grabbing my coat." She didn't ask questions, didn't ask for an explanation, didn't demand context, didn't try to convince me that talking it out would be healthier than whiskey on a Thursday night. Jade Ferreira was the only person in the world who knew when to give me comfort and when to give me alcohol, and that night the answer was unequivocally the second option. 10 minutes later, she sent the address, Clover and Ash, downtown. Take an Uber, not a cab. The Clover and Ash was the kind of bar Jade picked when she wanted the night to feel different from the rest. Sophisticated without being pretentious, lit just right to make you feel beautiful even when you were falling apart on the inside, and with an Irish whiskey menu she knew better than her own phone number. I got there before her, which was rare, and said a lot about the state I was in, and sat at the bar with my purse in my lap, and my eyes still dry with an almost irritating determination. I ordered a whiskey without knowing the name, and took the first sip standing up, still in my coat, before I'd even properly sat down. The bartender looked at me with that discreet expression of someone who's seen plenty of people walk into a bar wearing exactly that face and had the decency not to say anything. I thanked him mentally. I'd been inside that place for 30 seconds and already needed every shred of dignity I could pull together. Jade arrived with her hair still half up and the expression of someone who'd shown up ready to hear the unimaginable. "Tell me," she said, taking the stool next to mine and already raising a finger at the bartender. "Finn," I said. "I went to surprise him and caught him in bed with another woman." She stayed silent for exactly 2 seconds. "Son of a bitch." "Exactly. Did you cry?" "Not yet. Are you going to?" I considered the question seriously. "Later. Right now, I want a drink." Jade raised the glass she'd just received. "Then drink." I don't know how many glasses later it was that something in me decided the shock was no longer big enough to hold everything I was feeling, and that the only reasonable solution was to dance. It wasn't something I'd normally do. I wasn't the type to dance alone at the bar of a upscale lounge in downtown Chicago on a Thursday night, but the whiskey had done that specific job of convincing my brain that the normal rules were temporarily suspended. Jade encouraged me with a broad, unrepentant wave, and I stood up with my glass raised toward the ceiling as if toasting someone only I could see. The music was good, the alcohol was better, and for a moment, just one moment, the image of the shattered marble and Finn's face turning in the bed pulled back just enough for me to breathe for real for the first time in hours. I spun once, twice, laughed at something Jade shouted from her seat, and didn't care about a single thing or a single person around me. I didn't know someone was watching me from the floor above, up on the mezzanine of the Clover and Ash, in a private room overlooking the main floor. Ronan Callahan closed the last folder on the table and dismissed the 2 men who had been sitting across from him for the past 40 minutes. The meeting had ended the way his meetings always ended, with silence, with decisions made without debate, and with the sense that none of the parties involved needed any more words to understand what had been agreed upon. He stood, buttoned his jacket with an automatic motion, and walked toward the stairs. Cillian McGuire was 2 steps behind him, as always, with that particular silence of someone who had learned that the only useful function of a shadow is to make no noise. Ronan took the first step down, then the second, and then he stopped. From the floor below, a laugh floated up, strange, half hysterical, carrying that layer of desperation alcohol tries to hide but never quite manages. He looked down almost on instinct, the way you look toward a sound that has no business being where it is, and found a young woman in the middle of the floor with a glass of whiskey raised to the ceiling, dancing alone as if the entire world owed her that song. Ronan stood on the step for a few seconds. He recognized the face before he recognized what it meant, and when the second understanding arrived, something along the line of his jaw set in a way that was imperceptible to anyone who didn't know him very well. Cillian knew. Ronan should have kept walking down, should have slipped out through the side hallway, gotten in the car, and let Chicago sort out its own problems the way it always did. Instead, he stood watching for a few seconds longer than any sensible decision would allow, and then, with that deliberate calm of someone who rarely acts without calculating, he began to descend the rest of the stairs. Chapter 2: The Dawn and the Drunk Girl. I saw him before I understood who he was, or rather, I recognized him before I could organize the recognition into anything that made sense, because the whiskey had done that specific job of scrambling the order of things without erasing any of them. He was coming down the mezzanine stairs with the ease of a man who has never needed to rush in his life, the dark jacket impeccable, his shoulders exactly as wide as a man who takes up space without asking permission, and there was something in the way he moved that made the entire room feel a little smaller around him. I stopped dancing without realizing I'd stopped. Jade, who was 2 steps behind me with her glass in hand, tilted her head toward me. "Lara, you've been staring at that man for 20 seconds. "I know," I said, without looking away. "That's rude." "I know," I repeated. He reached the ground floor, and that's when I truly recognized him, and the entire architecture of my night collapsed in a completely different way than it had already collapsed before. Ronan Callahan, Finn's father. The man I'd met at 2 family dinners where I'd smiled politely, said as little as necessary, and spent the whole time with the uncomfortable awareness that there was something about that presence I didn't quite know how to categorize. He was the type of man who needed no introduction in any room, and I, at that moment, was a 24-year-old girl slightly drunk at a bar in Chicago, with her heart on the floor and her eyes locked on him. The situation was not good. He saw me before he got close, which I only realized afterward, because there was something in his eyes that suggested he was rarely caught off guard by anything. He walked toward me with the composure of someone who doesn't change pace for any outside reason, and the man who had been 2 steps behind him on the stairs, tall, quiet, with the face of someone trained to have no expression, held back at a discreet distance while Ronan came over to me. me. He stopped about a yard away, looked me over, not the way men sometimes look, but the way someone assesses a problem they hadn't expected to run into that night. "Lara," he said, in that low, controlled voice I remembered from the dinners. "What happened?" And then I did the most embarrassing thing of my life up to that point. I looked up at him with eyes shining from alcohol, and from a brand of honesty the whiskey had completely unleashed, and said, with total conviction and zero filter, "My God, you are so much more handsome than he is. That is completely unfair. Why is the father better looking than the son?" Jade made a sound that was not quite a choke and not quite a laugh, but was clearly both at the same time. 2 steps behind Ronan, the quiet man tightened his jaw with the visible effort of someone swallowing a smile with everything they had. Ronan didn't move, didn't look away. He just stood there watching me with an expression I couldn't read. It wasn't irritation, it wasn't amusement, it was something in between that looked more like attention than anything else. With a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture, he dismissed the man behind him. The quiet one stepped back and disappeared without making a single sound. "What happened?" he repeated, completely ignoring what I had just said, as though my observation about the aesthetic hierarchy of the Callahan family was a piece of information he had received, filed away, and decided not to process just yet. I told him everything. It wasn't a decision, it was an avalanche. The words came out in the wrong order, mixed in with the smell of the sauce I'd spent 40 minutes making, and with the image of the shattered marble, and with the anger that had been dammed up since the elevator, and that the whiskey had finally found an outlet for. I told him about the dinner, about the spare key, about the woman in Finn's bed, and as I talked, the tears mixed with the anger, mixed with the alcohol, and everything became more honest than any sober version of me would ever have allowed. Ronan stood there listening without interrupting me once, which was, in itself, a kind of presence I wasn't used to. Finn always interrupted. Everyone always interrupted. Ronan Callahan stood there with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes fixed on me while I poured out the whole night into the space between us, and there was something in that stillness that made it impossible to stop talking. "You know, I always thought you were better looking," I said, at a point where the filter had completely vanished. Since the very first dinner, I was ashamed of myself for it. Silence. He didn't respond, but he didn't look away either, and there was something in the way he was watching me that was different from how he had looked at me before. No longer assessment, no longer calculated concern, but something deeper and quieter that I couldn't name in that moment. I stepped closer, then 1 step more. My hands found the lapel of his jacket before I knew what they were doing. "Stay here with me," I said. He went absolutely still. He didn't pull back, didn't push me away, but he didn't move closer either. He just stood there with my hands on the lapel of his jacket, and something in his eyes that looked like an internal war being waged with enough efficiency to keep it off his face. When he spoke, his voice was in the same register as before, low, controlled, firm, but there was something underneath it that I was too young and too drunk to identify with any precision. "This is not a good idea," he said, and I, armed with all the wisdom that 2.5 glasses of Irish whiskey can produce, did exactly what any sensible person would not. I kissed him. It was quick, it was bold, and it was completely real. My mouth against his for a second that lasted longer than it should have because he didn't pull back immediately, and that extra half second, was the most devastating thing of the entire night, even more so than the shattered marble in Finn's apartment. Because he could have pulled back at second 0, and he didn't, and what that meant was something I was far too far from sober to process. Then he took a step back. Slowly, with that composure intact as though nothing had happened, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and typed something on his phone. 2 seconds later, the quiet man reappeared from somewhere as though he'd never left. "Car out front," Ronan said to him, in a tone so low I barely caught it. "Now." Jade appeared at my side as if she'd materialized out of thin air, eyes wide and wearing the expression of someone who had just witnessed something that was going to be talked about for weeks. "Lara," she whispered, in the specific tone of someone trying to be discreet and failing completely. "You just kissed Finn Callahan's father." "I know. At the Clover and Ash." "I know, Jade. In front of at least 20 people in suits." I looked at her. She looked back at me. There was an expression on her face that was half horror and half pure admiration, and under any other circumstances I would have laughed. But in that moment, the room had started spinning in a slightly inconvenient way. Ronan came back. He stood in front of me for a moment, looking me over with that expression I had already given up trying to decode. "You're leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine," I said, which was a transparent lie in at least 3 different ways. I know, he answered, with a calm that suggested he knew exactly how much of a lie was involved. You're still leaving. I have no clear memory of the ride. I have fragments: the leather seat of the car, the lights of Chicago passing by the window like a sequence of golden and white smears, the scent of his jacket that was subtle and dark, and completely different from anything I would ever associate with Finn. At some point between the clover and ash and my apartment, I rested my head on Ronan Callahan's shoulder with the naturalness of someone who is falling asleep and no longer has the resources to worry about what that means. I don't know if he moved. I don't know if he went rigid or breathed differently or looked down with that contained expression I had been trying to read all night. All I know is that when I opened my eyes again, I was in my hallway with my key in my hand, and the door open, and the dark car had disappeared down the street below. I walked into the apartment, sat on the edge of the bed with my shoes still on, and stared at the wall for a stretch of time I couldn't measure. In the driver's seat of the car making its way through downtown Chicago, Cillian McGuire said nothing for 3 full city blocks. Then, without taking his eyes off the road, "Problem, boss?" From the back seat, Ronan Callahan stared straight ahead, jaw set, eyes fixed on some point beyond the windshield. "Drive," he said. Chapter 3: Whiskey, Shame, and Jade. With no filter, consciousness came back in layers, the way it always does when you don't want it to come back. First came the light, that white, merciless October morning brightness pushing through the gap in the curtain, as if it had something to prove. Then came the ceiling, which I recognized as my own ceiling, with a split second of relief before memory started doing its work. And then, slowly, with that particular cruelty of a brain that chooses exactly the most painful order to put things back together, the previous night began reassembling itself, piece by piece, with a precision I hadn't asked for and was in no condition to refuse. The dinner, the key, the hallway, the bedroom. I closed my eyes again, as if that would solve anything, and lay on my back for a stretch of time I couldn't measure, with the heaviness in my chest that belongs specifically to someone who hasn't cried everything that needs to be cried, and whose body already knows the bill is coming. Finn, 2 years. The dark-haired woman who didn't even have the decency to pull up the sheet before looking at me. The glass jar on the marble floor. The elevator. And then, because my memory is absolutely relentless, came the rest. The bar, the whiskey, the staircase, the dark jacket, and me, with all the grace that 2 years of a demolished relationship and 3 shots of Irish whiskey can produce, looking at Ronan Callahan and saying out loud, at the clover and ash, that he was better looking than his own son. I buried my face in the pillow. I lay there with my eyes open for 40 minutes, reconstructing every detail in the most humiliating possible order, which was the only order in which the details presented themselves. The lapel of his jacket between my fingers, the half-second, that cursed half-second, when he didn't pull back, the car, his shoulder, Chicago through the window, and the last thing I had felt before blacking out entirely, which was the strange and absolutely inconvenient sensation that, for the first time all night, I had felt safe. That, I concluded with the pillow still over my face, was a problem of considerable proportions. "You're awake," said a voice beside me. I moved the pillow. Jade was sitting on the edge of the bed with 2 cups of coffee, legs crossed, hair thrown up in whatever, wearing the expression of someone who had slept on my couch without complaining, and now expected to be rewarded with the full, unedited version of events. She held out one of the cups with the solemnity of someone presenting evidence at a trial. I sat up, took the coffee, took a long sip. "So," Jade said. "No, Lara, no. Jade, you kissed your ex's dad." I closed my eyes. It wasn't exactly a kiss. She tilted her head with the patience of someone prepared to wait as long as it takes. "You put your mouth on his mouth. That's a kiss, Lara." I had no argument. Technically, and Jade was above all else, a woman who operated in the realm of technically, she was completely right, and we both knew it. And the silence that settled between us had the specific texture of a truth that nobody has enough energy to debate at 8 in the morning on a Friday. I was in the middle of my second sip of coffee when the phone buzzed on the nightstand. Unknown number. No name saved. The message was short, and I read it twice before I processed what I was reading, because my brain was still running on the residual delay of a night of whiskey and too much emotion. "Hope you're okay. What happened last night stays between us." Jade, who had leaned over my shoulder with the discretion of a person who has absolutely no discretion, made a sharp sound I had never heard from her before, a mix of shock and euphoria that she probably kept in reserve for truly extraordinary occasions. "A man in a suit sent a text first thing in the morning," she said, at the volume of someone who had completely forgotten we were in an apartment and not a stadium. Lara, Jade, lower your voice. I cannot lower my voice in this specific context. Try." She grabbed the phone out of my hands before I could react, read the message one more time, then looked at me with an expression that was 90% admiration and 10% genuine concern. Are you going to answer? I looked at the message, at those two short, controlled sentences that had somehow the same quality as his voice, direct, unadorned, containing no information beyond what was strictly necessary, and at the same time heavy with everything that wasn't written. Not yet, I said. I was standing in the kitchen, in underwear and a t-shirt, making the second round of coffee with the focus of someone who needs something to do with their hands, when the buzzer rang. Jade and I looked at each other. She raised an eyebrow. I walked to the intercom with an uncomfortable premonition that confirmed itself before I even pressed the button. It was Finn. I buzzed him in without saying anything, because there was a part of me that needed to see it in person to believe it was real, that he had woken up that morning, after everything, and decided that showing up with flowers and his usual rehearsed speech was a reasonable strategy. He arrived at my apartment 2 minutes later, with a bouquet of pink gerbera daisies that annoyed me in an irrational and very specific way, and with that Finn Callahan remorseful expression I had seen before in smaller situations, and that had never fully convinced me even then. "Lara," he said, when I opened the door. His voice was calibrated to the exact tone of calculated remorse. "I need you to let me explain." I looked at him for a moment, looked at the flowers, looked at him again. "It's over, Finn," I said. He frowned, as though the sentence didn't make sense. "You're angry right now. We can talk later when there is no later." The words came out steadier than I expected, and that steadiness surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him, because there was something different in it I couldn't name yet. A kind of clarity that the previous night had installed in me without asking permission, as though something had rearranged itself while I slept. Finn opened his mouth to continue, and I closed the door. From the couch, Jade raised a closed fist toward the ceiling. "Hallelujah," she said, with the solemnity of an amen. The afternoon moved slowly, the way afternoons move when you're trying not to think about something and failing methodically every 10 minutes. I made a list of projects that needed attention, answered 2 client emails, opened my sketchbook and closed it without writing anything useful, and made a 3rd round of coffee that neither of us needed, but that gave us something to hold on to while Jade sat in the living room armchair watching me with the expression of someone who has a very specific thing to say and is simply waiting for the right moment. The right moment arrived around 4 in the afternoon. "You're going to answer his message," she said, not a question. "Jade, Lara, a man who could have simply had someone put you in a cab, rode in the car with you all the way to your building, waited for you to get inside, and then texted in the morning to make sure you were okay." She paused to let the argument land. "That is not the behavior of an indifferent man." I looked at the phone on the coffee table, at the nameless number. At those 2 sentences I had reread more times than I was willing to admit. "He's my ex's father," I said. "Technically, your ex is just his son." "Jade, that's the same thing said differently. It's an alternative perspective." I picked up the phone, stared at the message for a few more seconds, thumb hovering over the screen, with the feeling of standing at the edge of something that, once crossed, couldn't be undone. I didn't answer, but I didn't delete it either. That night, lying in the dark with the phone face down on the nightstand, and the apartment silent, I kept thinking about that half-second. Not about the kiss. The kiss I could file away in the mental folder labeled reasonable mistake given the circumstances. But the half-second before he pulled back, that fraction of time when he had gone completely still with my mouth on his, and had done absolutely nothing to push me away, that I couldn't file anywhere. Because there was an enormous difference between a man who pulls back immediately and a man who chooses to pull back. And Ronan Callahan had chosen. I turned over in the dark, closed my eyes harder than necessary, and ordered my brain to stop working in that particular direction with the authority of someone who knows full well the order won't be followed. It wasn't. Chapter 4. The Purse and the Hour and a Half. I had completely forgotten about the purse. Not in a distant way, the kind where something slips from memory and sits quietly waiting to be remembered. I had forgotten it, with that specific intensity of someone who has too many things taking up space in their head to also account for the whereabouts of a beige leather bag. And it wasn't until the 3rd day after the night at the Clover and Ash that I realized it wasn't where it should be. I searched the apartment with a steadily decreasing conviction, opened cabinets that made no sense, looked under the bed with the unfounded optimism of someone not yet ready to accept the obvious conclusion, and then stood in the middle of the living room as the realization arrived slowly and inconveniently. The purse was in Ronan Callahan's car. Jade, who was in the kitchen making tea as if she lived there, looked up when I came back and read my expression with the accuracy of someone who has known me long enough to understand what each variation of my silence means. "What is it?" "My purse." She blinked once. "It's in his car. It's in his car." She set her mug on the counter with a calm I suspected was rehearsed. "Lara, that's a sign from the universe. That's a lapse caused by emotional stress and Irish whiskey. Both things can be true at the same time." I sent a message to the nameless number that afternoon, short and in the most neutral tone I could manage, saying I had left my purse behind and asking how I could pick it up. The reply took 40 minutes, long enough for me to check my phone a number of times I refused to count, and when it came, it was equally short and equally neutral, which was somehow more unsettling than anything else he could have written. I can bring it by. Tomorrow, if that works. If that works. The phrasing stuck in my head with a strange quality, as if he had chosen it with specific care to imply nothing beyond what it said. I replied yes. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to treat this as something that required preparation, and failed fairly completely because by the next morning I had tidied the living room, watered plants that didn't need watering, and picked out my outfit with an amount of attention that was entirely disproportionate for a purse handoff. Jade texted me at 10 in the morning. Has he been yet? I replied, not yet. She sent back a hourglass emoji I decided to ignore. He arrived exactly on time, which didn't surprise me. There was something about the way Ronan Callahan existed in the world that suggested he arrived neither early nor late, but always precisely when he'd said he would, as though time operated slightly differently in his vicinity. I buzzed him in, went downstairs to get the purse at the front door with a clear and well-defined intention of grabbing it, saying thank you, and going back up. And when I opened the door, he was there with the purse in hand, and that composed expression I had started to recognize as his permanent state. Thank you, I said, taking the purse. He nodded. There was a pause, one of those textured pauses that hang in the air between two people with more weight than ordinary silence. Would you like to come up for coffee? I said, and to this day, I don't know whether it was politeness or something else that wasn't entirely under my control. He looked at me for a second. It wasn't hesitation. It was that quiet assessment that seemed to be his way of processing any situation before deciding how to respond. Yes, he said. I hadn't expected him to say yes. That was evident from the way I crossed my apartment hallway with him 2 steps behind me and suddenly saw the space through eyes that were seeing it for the first time. The plants everywhere, the project sketches scattered across the coffee table, the slightly crooked bookshelf, Jade's coat still on the living room armchair from the last time she'd been here. It was an honest apartment, intentionally cluttered and full of things I loved, and it was the absolute opposite of any environment I associated with the man now standing in the entrance to my living room. I went to the kitchen without saying anything, with that busy hands energy that is the universal refuge of someone who doesn't quite know what to do with their own body. I heard the sound of his steps moving slowly through the space, and there was something in that sound, quiet, unhurried, that made me hyper-aware of every single thing he might be looking at. You do design? He asked from the living room. Graphic, I answered, from inside the kitchen. Freelance. Visual identities mostly, but I take on other projects when they interest me. And do they interest you often? I smiled without meaning to. Depends on what comes my way. I brought both cups, and found him standing by the window with one of my sketchbooks in his hand, not leafing through it, just holding it, looking at the cover as if he were assessing the object itself. He looked up when I came over, and there was something in that expression I couldn't identify in the moment, but that stayed with me afterward, when I tried to reconstruct the afternoon from beginning to end. He took the coffee without ceremony, and sat on the couch with that specific posture of a man who doesn't settle into any space, but doesn't look uncomfortable in any either, a kind of contained presence that occupied the room without needing to expand through it. We stayed for an hour and a half. It wasn't planned. It was the sum of a question that prompted an answer, that prompted another question. And suddenly Chicago was moving past the window in that lazy golden autumn afternoon light, and both cups were empty, and neither of us had moved to leave. I asked about the construction company, Callahan Development, which I knew by name and from a few project photos I'd seen at dinners with Finn, and he answered with an attentiveness that wasn't the kind people give when they're being polite. It was genuine, detailed, as if the question had opened something he didn't often open. He talked about the process of restoring old buildings on the north side, about the difference between building from scratch and recovering something that already had a history inside its walls, and there was something in the way he described it that made me understand, for the first time, that there was a layer to this man that existed completely outside anything I had ever imagined about him. At some point I said something about how hard it was to convince clients that simplicity was a choice and not a limitation, and he looked at me for a second with that expression of his and said quietly, "You're right. People confuse complexity with value all the time." And there was something in the way he said it, direct, unadorned, as if it were just an observation, that made me laugh for real, the way you laugh when someone says exactly the right thing without having tried to say the right thing. It was the first time I made him smile back, not an open smile. Ronan Callahan was clearly not the open smile type. It was a subtle movement at the corner of his mouth, contained and brief, but completely real, and I saw it and had to look away because there was something in it that was more unsettling than anything he had done or said since the night at the bar. The second time was when I went to get more coffee and tripped on the kitchen rug badly enough to produce an involuntary sound, and he asked, from the couch, in that very low voice of his, "You okay?" with an inflection that was 90% composed and 10% amused, and I answered with perfect composure from inside the kitchen, with a dignity that had no business being on me in that moment. And when I came back with the cups, he was looking out the window with that expression of his, but there was still the trace of something at the corner of his mouth that lasted until I sat back down. When he stood up to leave, the apartment immediately felt larger, which was the kind of information I would have preferred not to have about myself. I walked him to the door. He picked up the jacket he had folded over the arm of the couch, put it on with that automatic motion of someone who has done it for years without needing to think, and stood for a second in the doorway with the expression I had spent the entire afternoon trying to decode, and that kept eluding me. "Thank you for the coffee," he said. "Thank you for the purse," I said back. The corner of his mouth moved once. Barely. He left. I closed the door, leaned my back against it, and looked out at the living room for a moment with the strange feeling that the apartment had held onto something that hadn't been there before he walked in. Down below, in the dark car parked in front of the building, Cillian McGuire stayed quiet for 2 full city blocks after Ronan got in. Then, without taking his eyes off the road, bigger problem now, Ronan stared straight ahead, jaw in the position Cillian had recognized for 20 years. Drive. Chapter 5, The Kiss, Chicago Saw. The studio where I worked twice a week was in an old building on the east side, the kind with a great elevator and a tiled hallway floor, and a certain worn-down charm that I liked more than I'd ever admit to any client who asked about the space. It was shared with 3 other freelancers, a photographer, an illustrator, and a middle-aged man who did something with sound that I'd never quite managed to explain, and it had a huge window that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it impossible not to love being there. That Thursday I had stayed later than planned, which was a habit I had when a project entered that specific phase, where you start to see what you're trying to make and can't stop in the middle. The photographer and the illustrator had already left. The sound guy never seemed to leave anywhere, but also was never around when you needed him. And when I finally closed my laptop and grabbed my bag, the hallway was empty, and the parking lot lights below had already come on. I took the great elevator down, crossed the lobby, and went out through the side door that opened directly into the parking lot because it was the shortest route to the street where I caught my Uber. I was typing in my address when I heard the footsteps. They weren't normal footsteps in the sense that they were moving too fast and getting too close too fast, and there was something in their rhythm that my body recognized before my brain had finished processing the situation. I looked up from my phone and saw him, Marcus Alden, the client who had hired me 3 weeks earlier for a rebranding project, and who had spent the last 2 meetings proving, in increasingly less subtle ways, that he was interested in something that wasn't in the contract. I had said no in every way a professional person can say no. I had been clear. I had redirected. I had ended meetings early, and apparently none of it had worked, because he was there in the parking lot at 8 at night, with the expression of a man who had decided that the conversation that hadn't happened in the office was going to happen here. "Lara," he said, closing in too fast for me to create distance without making it an obvious move. "You always leave this late?" "I'm heading out now," I said, in the most neutral tone I could find. "We could grab a drink. There's a place right around here." "No. Thank you." I stepped sideways. He moved with me, and there was something in that movement, calculated, deliberate, that made something tighten in my chest in a way I didn't like. "Marcus, the project wraps up next week. Let's keep things professional." "I am being professional," he said, and smiled the way men smile when they're saying one thing and meaning another, and then he grabbed my arm. Not hard, not yet, but with that firmness of someone testing how far they can go, and I was about to open my mouth to say something at every decibel the situation called for, when I heard the sound of a car pulling up. The door opened before the engine had fully cut off. I recognized him by the way he got out, that calm that wasn't slowness, but seemed like slowness, because there was no urgency in his movements, no outward sign that anything out of the ordinary was happening. Ronan Callahan crossed the parking lot with his hands in his pockets, and the expression I had already learned to read as the state of maximum danger, precisely because it never changed. He didn't shout, didn't shove, didn't do any of the things I'd seen in movies that always seemed overblown. He walked up to Marcus Alden, stopped at a distance that was technically civil, but that in practice was the kind of distance that makes most men understand the space between them, has just shrunk significantly, and spoke quietly. So quietly that I was 2 yards away and couldn't make out a single word. But I saw Marcus's face. I watched the color leave it. I watched his shoulders drop in that specific, involuntary way that a body does when it receives information that goes beyond what pride can hold. He let go of my arm before I even realized he still had it, took a step back, then another, and then turned and walked away in the opposite direction without looking back once. The parking lot fell silent. Ronan stood still for a second, looking in the direction Marcus had gone, as though verifying something, and then turned to me with that expression that hadn't changed at any point throughout the entire thing. "What did you say to him?" I asked. "Nothing important," he said. It was an elegant lie, and we both knew it, but there was something in the way he said it, direct, unapologetic, with no expectation that I'd fully believe it, that was somehow more honest than any detailed explanation would have been. I stood there looking at him for a moment with my phone still in my hand and my bag on my shoulder, and the growing awareness that the parking lot was empty and quiet, and that Chicago kept on existing around us with all the usual indifference of a large city. "You don't need to protect me, Ronan," I said. He looked at me. "Clearly I do," he answered, in a tone that wasn't arrogance but wasn't modesty either. It was just the calm delivery of a conclusion he had drawn based on evidence. I paused. There was something in that answer, in that quiet certainty, that should have annoyed me and didn't, which was, in itself, a troubling piece of data about the state I was in. I took a step toward him, small, deliberate. His eyes didn't leave mine. "If I take one more step," I said, in a voice that came out lower than I had planned, "are you going to send me home again?" The silence lasted 2 full seconds. He stood completely still, with that restraint I had already learned wasn't coldness, but the exact opposite of it. And when he spoke, his voice was at a volume I had to move closer to hear clearly. "I probably should," he said. I took the step. He didn't pull back. This time there was no alcohol, no chaos of a ruined night, none of the mitigating circumstances I had used to file the kiss at the Clover and Ash under reasonable mistakes. There was only the parking lot, and the yellow glow of the streetlights, and the two of us standing at a distance that had stopped being a distance. And when I raised my face toward his, there was a brief moment where he stayed still, just looking, with that contained intensity that seemed to fill all the space between us, before he brought his mouth down to mine. The kiss was nothing like the first one. The first had been mine, impulsive, drunk, desperate in a way I hadn't been fully present enough to recognize. This one belonged to both of us, and there was an enormous difference in that, a difference I felt in the way he kissed back, with the restraint of someone who had been holding something back for weeks, and was still holding it now, but with less margin, his fingers finding my jaw with a gentleness that was too careful to be casual. Chicago kept turning around us as if nothing had happened. When we stopped, he stayed there with his forehead resting against mine, and I could hear his breathing, deeper than usual, the only concession that man seemed willing to make to the fact that something had just happened between us. I closed my eyes for a second, and tried to find a clear thought somewhere inside the chaos my brain had become, but there wasn't one available. "You don't know what world you're stepping into," he said, his voice very low, carrying something that was neither a warning nor a promise, but was both at the same time. I opened my eyes. He was looking at me up close, with that expression I had spent weeks trying to decode and that now, from this distance, was revealing something he clearly wasn't used to letting show. "Then tell me," I said. He was silent. Not the silence of someone thinking through an answer, the silence of someone who already knows the answer and is weighing exactly how much of it they're willing to give. There was a war happening there, quiet and contained like all his wars, and I stood waiting for the outcome with a patience I didn't know I had. He didn't tell me, but he didn't leave either, and there was an enormous difference in that, a difference I held on to carefully as we stood there in the empty parking lot with Chicago all around us, and the weight of everything unsaid occupying the space between us, with a presence just as solid as any word would have been. At some point he walked me to the street, waited for the Uber to arrive, and stood on the sidewalk until the car turned the corner. I watched him through the rear window until he disappeared, and there was something in that image, him standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, and the city around him like a backdrop, that stayed with me the entire ride home with a persistence I had already given up fighting. He hadn't told me. But the way he had stood there, still, with his forehead against mine, that part I kept reliving with every block the car covered, with that irritating clarity of things you feel before you understand them, and that understand you completely before you understand them back. Chapter 6. The Clover on His Wrist and What It Means. Things between us grew in silence, the way things grow when nobody has named them yet. There was no agreement, no conversation defining what it was or what it intended to be. There were late-night messages that started with some small question and ended half an hour later without either of us noticing exactly when the time had passed. There was a dinner at an Italian restaurant on the north side that could have been a coincidence if either of us had still been willing to hold on to that version. There was the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, and the fact that I always was, and that he probably knew I always was, and that neither of us did anything with that information except hold on to it. Jade called it dating. I called it an undefined situation. Ronan probably called it a problem, but he had stopped acting like it was one, which in his vocabulary was the equivalent of a declaration. The city helped. Chicago in October has that particular quality of a setting that makes everything more intense than it needs to be. The wind with its taste of lake, the golden light that doesn't last long and for that reason seems more beautiful, the north side streets with their mix of old brick and modern glass that makes the city look like two things at once. I found myself paying attention to Chicago in a way I never had before, which probably said more about the state I was in than about the city. The question about the tattoo came up on a Wednesday afternoon when the two of us were sitting at one of the back tables of a small cafe on the east side, the kind of place with only 8 tables and a handwritten wine list on the chalkboard, which Ronan had suggested with the ease of someone who knows every corner of the city he ordinarily avoids being seen in. I had a sketchbook open in front of me with drafts for a project I had stopped being able to look at the moment he walked in, and he had his jacket folded on the chair beside him, and his shirt cuffs rolled with that specific precision I had started to notice as a habit. That was when I saw the clover again. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed it. It had been there at every meeting, on his left wrist, 3 leaves in black ink with that quality of something made to last. But that afternoon, with the cafe light hitting it at a particular angle, and Ronan with his elbow resting on the table while he read something on his phone, I stared long enough for him to notice I was staring. "The tattoo," I said. It wasn't exactly a question, but it was clearly an invitation. He put the phone down, looked at his own wrist for a second, with that expression I had already learned to recognize as the moment just before he decided how much to open. "It's family," he said. "Everyone has one." A brief pause. "Every man in the family." Yes. I looked at the clover up close for the first time. 3 symmetrical leaves, the ink dense and unadorned, no date or name around it, just the symbol itself with the economy of something that doesn't need to explain what it means to the people who need to know. "It looks like a weight," I said, without thinking too hard about it. He looked at me. There was something in his expression that was different from the usual assessment, deeper, quieter, as if the observation had landed somewhere he wasn't expecting. "It is," he said, simply. I didn't push. I had learned over these weeks that Ronan Callahan opened up in exact proportion to how much you didn't force the opening, and that pushing closed more than any silence would. I filed his answer alongside everything else I had been accumulating about that man. Small things, dense things, each one carrying more weight than its size suggested. That same evening, back at the apartment, Jade was on the bed with her laptop, and the expression of someone conducting unrequested research with no intention of stopping. "Lara," she said, without looking up from the screen. "What?" "I'm looking at some things." "What kind of things?" She turned the laptop toward me. The screen showed a search results page. Nothing specific. Nothing concrete, but enough. Family names, vague references to businesses in Chicago, 1 or 2 old newspaper articles that talked about Callahan development in the careful language of someone writing about something they don't want to say outright. And in one of the articles, almost in passing, a mention of the black clover as the symbol of one of the oldest families on the north side. I stared at the screen for a moment without saying anything. "Lara," Jade said, in a voice that had dropped 2 registers from her usual, which in her was a sign of genuine seriousness. "This man is not just a businessman." "I know." She kept looking at me. "And you're okay with that?" I paused. The honest answer was too complicated to fit in one sentence, so I said the part I was sure of. "I don't know yet." Jade closed the laptop slowly. "Okay," she said. "But Lara, if you do know, and the answer is no, you tell me before you do anything heroic. Okay? Heroic? You have a tendency to walk toward complicated things without warning anyone." I didn't answer, which was, in itself, a kind of answer. Victoria showed up on a Tuesday. I didn't see her. I found out afterward, in fragments, from the way Ronan went quieter than usual in a message that night, and from the story Jade extracted from a source she never fully revealed, but that I suspected involved the Clover and Ash security guard she had charmed on the night of the bar. Victoria Hale was 40, moved through the right circles of Chicago, with the ease of someone built for it, and had been with Ronan long enough to know exactly how he worked, which, according to Jade, was the most dangerous kind of knowledge a woman could have about a man from that world. She had shown up at the Callahan development offices that afternoon with the elegance of someone who doesn't need appointments because she never has, and had made it all the way up to Ronan's floor before Pat Byrne intercepted her in the hallway. She had left without getting into the office, but she hadn't left with anything resolved, that I understood, even without having been there, even without having seen anything beyond the specific silence Ronan had produced that night. There was something in the way he had gone quiet that said Victoria Hale was not a closed situation. She was a situation deciding what to do next, which was an entirely different thing. Jade, laptop open again, and wearing the analyst expression she adopted when she was connecting dots. She knows about you. You don't know that. I have a very well-developed intuition for situations involving a woman who has lost ground and is mapping the field. I looked at her. You just made that up. That is ancient feminine wisdom, Lara, and you should respect it more. Finn found out that week. Not everything. Not about the parking lot. Not about the messages. Not about the hour and a half over coffee in my apartment. But he found out that his father had come to pick up his car that night at the Clover and Ash, and that I had left in his car. The information had come from a bar security guard who worked indirectly for him, which told me something about Finn I would have preferred not to know. I didn't see him, but Jade texted me one afternoon saying she had run into him at a coffee shop downtown, and that there was something different about the way he was. Not the performative anger of the flowers and the rehearsed apologies, but something quieter and deeper, the kind that comes just before a decision. Keep your eyes open, she wrote. I read the message twice and put my phone away, but the warning stayed with me with the persistence of things you don't want to take seriously and that your gut won't let go. That night, lying in bed with Chicago visible through the window, I thought about the Clover again. I thought about the way Ronan had looked at his own wrist before answering, not with pride, not with shame, but with that specific weight of someone who has carried something for so long they can no longer imagine their own wrist without it. I thought about the word he had used. Weight. Simple. Direct. No elaboration, and for that reason more honest than any long explanation would have been. There was a version of me, 3 weeks earlier, who would have gotten out of bed at that moment and made a list of sensible reasons to take 3 steps back and leave Ronan Callahan and the Black Clover and all the invisible structure around them exactly where they were. That version still existed. She kept showing up from time to time, with the practical and slightly tired voice of someone who has seen this movie before. The problem was, there was another version too. The one who had stood in that parking lot with her forehead against his. The one who had learned that he laughed twice, and that both times were completely real. The one who had held on to the word wait, with the care of someone who knows that people only tell the truth when they're not trying to tell the truth. That version was winning, and Chicago outside, with all its lights and all its secrets, stayed completely quiet about it, as if it already knew what I was still trying to decide. Chapter 7. The Night at the Penthouse. The excuse I came up with was reasonable enough to use, and weak enough that we both knew exactly what it was. I said I had a file on my laptop that needed input from someone with experience in construction projects, a question of proportion in a visual identity for a new client, something that couldn't wait, something that made sense to bring to him. I sent the message at 8 on a Thursday night, and lay staring at the ceiling for 2 minutes while I waited for the reply, with the laptop open beside me as evidence of good faith and my heart beating at a rhythm that had nothing to do with proportion in visual identity. The reply came in 3 minutes. Come, just that, one word. And there was something in that word, direct, unadorned, with no question about the file, that told me he knew exactly what the excuse was, and that he had said yes anyway. Jade was in the living room armchair when I grabbed my bag, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who already knows everything and is simply waiting for the formal confirmation. I'm going to see a client, I said, at 8 at night. It's a busy client. Lara, Jade. She pointed at me with her index finger, with the solemnity of someone delivering a verdict. Text me when you get there, and when you leave, and at any intermediate point you deem relevant. The penthouse was in one of the tallest buildings on the north side of Chicago, the kind you look up at from the street and can't quite see the top of, because it disappears into the low mist the city insists on keeping as a permanent accessory. The doorman was expecting me by name. The elevator was already unlocked for the floor, and when the doors opened directly into the apartment entrance, I needed a second to take in the space before I could move. It was enormous, and it was quiet, and it was somehow completely Ronan. No excess, no decorative showing off, none of those surfaces that exist only to impress. There were real books on a real shelf. There was a work desk with papers that were clearly being used. There were plants, which surprised me in a way I hadn't expected. And there was the window. The window took up the entire south wall, floor to ceiling, and Chicago below was a different thing from that angle. Not the city from inside, with its noise and its urgencies, but the city seen from outside, lit up and silent and vast, like a glowing map someone had forgotten to turn off. Ronan was standing near the window with a glass in his hand, jacket absent for the first time I could remember, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked at me when I walked in and said nothing for a moment, just looked, the way he looked when he wasn't trying not to. Chicago looks different from up here, I said, walking over to the window and standing beside him with the city below. I see everything differently from up here, he answered. And there was something in the way he said it that made me unsure whether he was talking about the window. The tension of weeks arrived in that room, the way everything arrives that has been held back too long. Not all at once, not loudly, but with that mounting pressure of something that has nowhere left to go but forward. We talked for a while about the project that was a pretext, and about other things that were no pretext at all, and Chicago darkened outside while the distance between us in front of the window narrowed in a way that neither of us consciously initiated, and neither of us stopped. He was the one who turned first. Not quickly. Nothing about that man happened quickly, but with that deliberateness I had already learned to recognize as the way he made decisions. Completely, without half measures, without any possibility of pretending the movement had been accidental. His hand found my face with a gentleness that was out of proportion for a man with those hands, and he stayed still for a second, just looking at me up close, as if giving one of us a last chance to pull back. Neither of us pulled back. What happened next had the quality of things that have been waited for long enough that the waiting becomes part of them. Every gesture carried the weight of the weeks before it. Every closeness held the memory of all the closeness that had stopped halfway. He was careful in a way I hadn't expected from a man like him, or maybe had expected precisely because he was a man like him. There was an attention to detail, a slowness that wasn't hesitation but choice, as if each moment were a renewed decision to continue. His hands knew direction without rushing, and there was a language in his gestures I didn't need to translate, only receive, slowly, with the growing awareness that this was different from anything I had experienced before. His shirt disappeared, mine too, and Chicago kept on glowing through the window, as if the world outside didn't know, or didn't care, that two people were truly meeting each other for the first time, 30 floors above everything. I remember the warmth of his skin against mine. I remember his hands on my waist with that firmness that wasn't possession, but presence, complete, deliberate, entirely focused on me in a way that made any thought outside that room impossible to hold. I remember closing my eyes at some point, and Chicago disappearing entirely, as if the whole city had made room for that specific moment to expand without limit. There was a point when he stopped, his eyes on mine, and looked at me with that expression I had spent weeks trying to decode, and that now, at this distance of inches, I read with a clarity that made me catch my breath. It wasn't just desire, though it was that too, and intensely. It was something deeper, older, the kind that frightens more than desire, because it has no scheduled time to pass. He pressed his forehead to mine when everything was over, exactly like in the parking lot, and breathed in deeply once, the only moment when that composure of his gave way enough for me to feel the real weight of what had happened between us. "Lara," he said, just my name, as if it were enough. It was. Afterward, we were quiet. Chicago still glowed through the window, unmoved, and the apartment held that specific stillness of after, dense, full, completely different from the silence of before. I was lying on my back, looking at the high penthouse ceiling, and he was beside me with his gaze fixed on some distant point I couldn't map. And for a while, neither of us said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said yet. Then I turned to face him. "Now tell me," I said, "for real, who are you?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at that distant point for a few more seconds, and then looked at the clover on his left wrist. That gesture, I had learned, wasn't a habit, but a reflex, the way he had of reminding himself of something before deciding how much to say. The silence lasted long enough for me to think he wasn't going to answer. Then he spoke, in that low voice with the quality of something said without ornament. "I'm the man who's going to complicate your life considerably." I looked at him. "Already have," I said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more internal than that. More real. The kind that shows up when a person is caught telling the truth without having planned to. And then he started talking. It wasn't everything. I knew it wasn't everything. There were layers he wasn't going to open that night. Maybe never. Maybe too much later for me to know what to do with them. But it was more than he had said in all the other times combined. And there was a different quality to the words that came out there, lying beside me with Chicago through the window. Less calculated, less measured, as if the apartment at that hour were the only place where he could let something go without first checking whether it was safe. He talked about the weight of the name, about the difference between inheriting a legacy and being consumed by it. He talked about the rules of the world he lived in, with the objectivity of someone who has long since stopped trying to justify things, and only describes them. And there was dignity in that, strangely, more than any justification would have had. I listened without interrupting, and when he stopped, I stayed quiet for a moment before saying, "Will you let me know when it's too late for me to leave?" He looked at me. "I'm letting you know now," he said. "Ronan, Lara, I heard you." A pause. And I'm still here. The buzzer rang at 11:30. Ronan went completely still for a second. That specific stillness of his that wasn't surprise but recognition, as if part of him had been expecting this. He got up, put his shirt on, went to the intercom with that calm I had already learned cost more than it appeared. I got up too, grabbed the shirt that was closest, his, I realized afterward, still carrying his scent, and walked to the living room while he spoke quietly with someone outside. It was Finn. I knew before I saw. The way you know things, the body processes faster than the mind. And when the door opened, and Finn Callahan walked into his father's penthouse with that look I recognized from a distance, not open anger, but that jaw tension he had when he was holding something bigger than he could manage, I stood in the middle of the living room in his shirt and said nothing. Finn looked at us, first at me, then at his father, then at me again. And something in his expression moved through several things in quick succession: anger, pain, a kind of bitter recognition, before settling somewhere quieter and more dangerous than any of them. "Dad," he said, in a completely flat voice. "Finn," Ronan answered, in the same tone. The silence between them lasted several seconds, and had a texture I couldn't fully read, because there was an entire history inside it that preceded me, and that I was only just beginning to touch the surface of. Then Finn looked at me one last time, a long, direct look that I didn't look away from, and said, "It's fine." 2 words. He turned and left, the door closing with a soft click that was somehow heavier than if he had slammed it. Ronan stood with his back to me for a moment after the door closed. When he turned, his expression was composed, but there was something in his eyes that was different from usual, an old tiredness, the kind that has nothing to do with the hour. I wanted to say something. I couldn't find what, but I knew, with that certainty of things felt before their thought, that it's fine wasn't true, that there was something in that exit that was too simple, in that voice that was too flat, in the look he had given me before leaving. That was the exact opposite of fine. Finn Callahan was planning something, and I had spent the entire night so deep inside that apartment suspended above Chicago that I hadn't even noticed the size of the world below. On the other side of the city, in an apartment with precise decor and not a single element out of place, Victoria Hale was dialing a number she hadn't used in months. When the call connected, she spoke in that low, controlled voice of someone who has rehearsed every word. "I need some information. About a girl." A pause. "The name I want is Lara Monroe." Chapter 8. The floor drops out. There was a lightness to that morning that I didn't recognize as mine. It was the kind of lightness that shows up when you stop pretending you don't want something and simply accept that you do. And it has a specific taste of relief mixed with vulnerability, mixed with that sharp awareness that you've crossed a line and the world on the other side of it is different from the world you came from. I was sitting at the kitchen counter in the penthouse in one of Ronan's shirts with a coffee he had made without asking how I took it, and that was perfect, which was the kind of small detail that arrived with an impact completely out of proportion to its size. He was on the other side of the counter reading something on his phone, standing, no jacket, with that quality of a man who occupies any space as if he had always been there. There was a silence between us that was different from all the silences before, easier, more real, without the tension of something still unresolved. I said something about the coffee. He responded with that dry wit I had learned to recognize as his version of affection, and I laughed for real, the way it comes out before you decide whether it should, and he watched me with that expression that still managed to be too intense to receive without looking away for at least 2 seconds. It was the kind of morning you hold on to. And then the buzzer rang. Ronan was in the kitchen when I went to the door, and that was the mistake I only recognized as a mistake when it was already too late to undo. If I had known who was on the other side, I would have called him first. I would have done anything other than simply turn the handle with the ease of someone still inside a good morning, who hasn't yet learned that good mornings can turn in a matter of seconds. The woman at the door was impeccable. Not beautiful in the conventional sense. Impeccable in the sense that every detail had been considered and was exactly where it needed to be. From the dark hair pinned with that precision that looks effortless but is entirely effort, to the right coat for the right temperature. She was around 40 with the eyes of someone who learned long ago that the most important information in any room is always the kind nobody is volunteering. She looked me over from head to toe, not aggressively, but with a thoroughness that inventoried every detail of me in under 3 seconds, including Ronan's shirt, including the coffee in my hand, including everything the sum of those 2 things said about the night before. And then she smiled. It was the specific smile of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing. "You must be Lara Monroe," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a confirmation. And she already knew my name before I opened the door, which took exactly 1 second to process, and which, once processed, installed a precise cold in the pit of my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the apartment. "I'm Victoria," she continued before I could respond. "I've been with Ronan for 4 years. The floor didn't drop out immediately. It dropped out slowly, the way floors drop when the information is too large to process all at once. One layer first, then another, and you stand there trying to find solid ground in a space that's reorganizing itself under your feet in real time. 4 years. I was standing there with the handle in my hand, and the coffee going cold and his shirt on my body, and she was at the door with that smile that hadn't moved a millimeter, and there was something in the geometry of that scene that was humiliating in a way I didn't yet have the vocabulary to fully describe. "But you probably don't know that," she said, with a voice that was gentle the way knives are sometimes gentle. "He's very good at compartmentalizing." She paused. The calculated kind of pause, the kind that exists to give the poison time to settle. "There's one more thing." Her eyes didn't leave mine. "That night at the Clover and Ash, I had someone there to tell me what happened. Ronan knew about Finn before he went. Someone tipped him off earlier that day. The coffee in my hand was completely cold. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, and it was the only thing I had to be grateful for in that moment. "Because you deserve to know who you're dealing with," she said, "and because he's never going to tell you." She turned and left with the posture of someone who has finished what she came to do and is in absolutely no rush. I stood in the doorway for a second that lasted much longer than a second before closing it. Ronan walks into the living room and stops when he sees my face. Something is wrong. Very wrong. I'm not crying. I'm not screaming. I'm calm. Too calm. For a few seconds, neither of us says anything. The entire apartment feels silent in a way that has nothing to do with the absence of noise. It's the silence of something about to break that hasn't broken yet. I raise my eyes slowly. My voice comes out low, controlled. "You knew." Ronan frowns. "Lara," I don't let him finish. "Before you went to the bar." A pause. "You knew about Finn." The silence turns heavy. He looks at me as if he's measuring every word, and there's something in that measuring, in that specific care about what he's going to say, that already says more than any answer could. I take a step toward him. Victoria was here. Now his expression shifts. Just a little, but I notice. "She said someone tipped you off that day." A pause. "That you knew about the affair before you walked into the Clover and Ash." Ronan doesn't answer, and that already says a great deal. My heart starts beating harder, not with anger. Not yet, but in that specific way of when a terrible idea crosses your mind, and you don't want it to reach the end, because you know that once it does, there will be no way left to unknow it. I swallow. "So tell me something." Silence. "That night." A pause. "When you showed up at that bar." My eyes are locked on his. Was it really a coincidence? Ronan goes still, and in that instant, I notice something that makes the floor disappear completely beneath my feet, because his expression isn't surprise. It isn't the expression of a man being accused of something he didn't do, who needs a moment to react to the injustice of it. It's the expression of someone who has just been found out. Quiet, heavy, with that specific recognition of something that was dammed up too long to pretend it doesn't exist. Ronan opens his mouth to answer, and what he's about to say changes completely the story of how we met. But Ronan's answer is the truth he never told me, because that night at the Clover and Ash didn't happen the way I've believed until now. And when I finally find out what really happened, I realize the man I fell in love with may have entered my life long before that first kiss. Well, that was the story, and as you've probably guessed, it doesn't end there. The good news is that Part 2 is already out. To access Part 2 and see how the story continues, it's super simple. Just click the first link in the pinned comment below. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click the very first link down in the comments, and Part 2 will be right there waiting for you. It's that easy. I'm Lena, and I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Just click the link in the first pinned comment.